Howdy folks, today we're looking at Batman 3 Jokers #1 from DC Comics in 2020. It's been a few years and the hype has finally died down. What better time to look back at one of the most controversial series in recent memory. Now, I've enjoyed some Geoff Johns books. He's got a knack for structure as well as expanding familiar concepts in novel ways. Those aren't small things, and together they've papered deficiencies in many readable stories. Now, sometimes I haven't cared for those novel directions, and definitely sometimes I don't like his characterization. But more than anything, what I don't enjoy about Johns has been his instinct towards adding more cruelty and arbitrary violence to his stories than strictly necessary. Now, of course, he's not the first person to ever do this, which is what this story is about. It's built largely as a direct response to perhaps the most cruel and arbitrary Batman story of all, The Killing Joke. Now, Johns didn't write that story, and I've always considered the fact that its original writer has more or less disowned it to be a rather telling acknowledgement that the story represented a particular point of terminus, an endpoint to the genre's ability to deal with the consequences of violence. That is the question up for debate in Three Jokers. Just how far can these stories go into that kind of Grand Guignol before they collapse of their own weight? Tellingly, there's nothing in these pages that seems specifically out of bounds or over the top in context. The worst violence here occurs off-panel and in flashback. The Joker killed Jason Todd a long time ago. Even if the erstwhile Robin got better, the moment he was almost beaten to death has lingered just as acutely as Barbara Gordon being paralyzed. Those stories are both 35 years old and were produced during one of Batman's most popular periods. So the argument that that kind of violence has no place in the franchise is frankly untenable, much as it goes against my preferences. The titular three Jokers in this story are dedicated to pain and mayhem as goals in and of themselves. It's even asserted that the Joker isn't really that funny anymore, and that's very true. That's not to say the story didn't make me laugh. After all, bringing back Gaggy, of all people, just to have a shark eat him is perhaps the most Geoff Johns thing Geoff Johns has ever done. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Batman 3 Jokers #2 from DC Comics in 2020. Now, while I believe a number of questionable decisions went into the making of this book at every step from conception to execution, I also want to single out Jason Fabok for his work. I quite like his art, and for that reason found this to be a very readable book despite my larger misgivings. Geoff Johns is clearly going for a mood piece in the mold, as I said, of The Killing Joke. Now, frankly, that book is not top shelf more by any measure. Even if you like it, it's a small subject built around the unquestionable skill of its artist. Whatever value it retains after decades of dilution and plagiarism is due to Brian Bolland's skill and imagination. Some of the less successful writerly effects here are transparent and deliberate attempts to borrow effects of Moore's. Now, The Killing Joke has been recolored over the years, based partly on Bolland's dissatisfaction with John Higgins' original work. Despite Bolland's clear skill, no one should ever have let him recolor that book. The new colors are flat, uninspired, and overly literal, without a jot of the garish wit of Higgins' gorgeous originals. If I were feeling ungenerous, I'd say that was the size of the matter for this story. An inflation of that same misguided impulse towards cod realism, flat, uninspired, and overly literal. But that only tells part of the story. Fabok, as I say, elevates the material. I like the way he draws these characters. They have weight and distinctive presence on the page. His Batman is a violent fireplug, his Batgirl intrepid and driven without losing her appeal. Frankly, I think he draws a great Batgirl. She comes out the best from this. Whether or not it was a creative mistake to restore the use of her legs, the story is built on the example of her strength. It is possible to lift yourself up from unspeakable tragedy, but it requires putting in the work to rebuild your character along the way. That's a real thing, a true message at the heart of this relentlessly overwrought pageant. I like Fabok's Batgirl. I'd read more of her. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Batman 3 Jokers #3 from DC Comics in 2020. Well, that was certainly a story. Was it a good story? Although there were parts I liked, I don't think it adds up to as much as it seems to want. Any story that places undue weight on the relationship between Batman and the Joker has to be greeted with some skepticism, given that the relationship never strikes me as significant as some creators believe. If you believe that Batman versus the Joker is a primal rivalry that speaks to an elemental schism in humanity's contemporary psyche, well, sure. You can see how the battle of the one truly sane man against the avatar of instability is an emblematic conflict. But that's a big if. Now, if, on the other hand, you tend to roll your eyes at Batman stories that take as a given that the characters have some kind of thematic significance beyond the page, well, it's difficult to see how this does anything but move the pieces on the board. The Joker works best as a mystery. Even as The Killing Joke was accepted into continuity, Moore's feint towards the Joker's origin was very gingerly left aside. If the character has any weight at all, the modern tendency towards towards explication can only lessen that impact. What Three Jokers appears to offer more than anything is the solution to a puzzle that didn't need to be solved. Did you really need to explain the Joker's different behavior at different points in his long career? The character changes, often unpredictably. What's interesting is that much of the story is actually focused on two characters who have changed considerably, Barbara Gordon and Jason Todd. Those are my favorite parts, actually, even down to Jason's doomed crush on Batgirl. Those scenes actually gave us something interesting. Two scarred people living with the consequences of having chosen violence as a way of life. The revelation that Batman knew the Joker's identity all along seems superfluous. No one is ever going to, or should ever, pull the thread of the Joker's lost wife and child. The story even says, explicitly, the Joker having a real name in history defeats the purpose of the character. Likewise, having so many ersatz Jokers complicates what is, at best, a very clean dynamic. Maybe it's best, then, to put this up merely as a kind of shaggy dog narrative. Cool story, bro. I'm happy for you, or sorry that happened. Either one.